In the autumn months of 1944, Japan's empire stood at the precipice of catastrophe. What had begun as a sweeping conquest across the South Pacific had transformed into a nightmare of defeats and dwindling resources. The American war machine, once stunned by Pearl Harbor, had awakened with terrible fury. Mountains of men and materiel, ships by the thousands, tanks and aircraft beyond counting, propelled a relentless advance that brought American forces to Japan's doorstep. Beneath the waves, American submarines hunted Japan's merchant vessels like wolves among sheep, strangling the flow of oil that sustained the empire's war effort. Confronted with an enemy poised to strike at the home islands themselves, Japanese strategists devised 4 desperate contingency plans, collectively known as the SHO plans. Each plan corresponded to a different axis of American advance: the Philippines, Formosa to the west, the Kuril Islands northeast of Japan, or the home island of Honshu itself. When intelligence confirmed that American forces were converging on the Philippines, Japan activated SHO-1, an audacious gambit that would commit nearly every remaining warship to a complex, multi-pronged assault. The plan's elegance masked its desperation. Vice Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa would lead a northern force of carriers southward from Japanese waters, deliberately exposing himself to draw away Admiral William F. Halsey's powerful American carrier fleet. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would command the center force, driving through San Bernardino Strait to strike American positions in Leyte Gulf from the north. Simultaneously, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura and Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima would lead separate forces through Surigao Strait, attacking from the south. If executed flawlessly, this coordinated assault would catch the American invasion forces in a devastating trap. The stakes could not have been higher. This operation wagered nearly everything Japan's navy still possessed. Failure would leave nothing to oppose America's growing naval dominance. Senior officers of the Imperial Army viewed the plan with alarm, understanding that defeat would further throttle the supply of overseas resources and cripple any defense of the home islands. The Navy, however, pressed forward, determined to strike before American factories could churn out even more ships and aircraft. Japan scraped together every available vessel. Ozawa's decoy force included 6 carriers: Ise Hyuga, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Kaidos, and Chiyoda, though they carried only 116 aircraft between them, as their purpose was to attract attention rather than fight effectively. 3 light cruisers and 8 destroyers screened this sacrificial force. To the south, Nishimura assembled 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers, which would rendezvous with Shima's 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers for the assault through Surigao Strait. The center force under Kurita represented Japan's mightiest punch. Built around Yamato and Musashi, the 2 most formidable battleships ever constructed, Kurita commanded 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 13 destroyers. This armada would thunder through San Bernardino Strait, emerging hopefully into undefended waters to savage the American landing operations on Leyte. Success would preserve the Philippines, delay the American juggernaut by weeks or months, and keep the enemy distant from Japan's sacred shores. Yet before the fleet even departed, a critical element of the plan crumbled. Kurita had counted on air support from Japanese aircraft stationed in the Philippines, but American strikes on Filipino airfields, combined with Halsey's devastating raid on Formosa, obliterated most of these planes. Fewer than 100 aircraft remained operational in the Philippines, nowhere near enough to shield Kurita from the aerial onslaught he would surely face during his voyage to San Bernardino Strait. In one of war's cruel ironies, word of this disaster never reached Kurita. Unaware that his air umbrella had been shredded, he prepared to traverse the wide Sibuyan Sea completely exposed. When enemy aircraft found him, and they would, he would have nothing but his ships' guns to fight back. The great operation commenced on October 18, 1944, when Admiral Somu Toyoda, chief of the Japanese Naval General Staff, transmitted the execute order for SHO-1. Kurita led his flotilla from Lingga Roads near Singapore to Brunei Bay in Borneo that same day. After refueling on October 22nd, he took his ships to sea, steering northwest toward Palawan Passage. From there, he would cross the Sibuyan Sea, rush through San Bernardino Strait, and fall upon the Americans. Nishimura departed his anchorage near Singapore on the afternoon of October 22nd, heading for the Sulu Sea, while Shima steamed southward from the north, both converging on Surigao Strait below Leyte Gulf. The final element, Ozawa's sacrificial force, left Kure in the home islands on October 20th, carefully skirting beyond the range of American search planes on Saipan to avoid premature detection as it steered toward the northern Philippine Islands. Ozawa harbored no illusions about his fate. "I expected complete destruction of my fleet," he would later acknowledge. "But if Kurita's mission was carried out, that was all I wished." The entire edifice of SHO-1 thus depended on Kurita reaching his objective. Doubts about this prospect surfaced almost immediately. Far out at sea, the crews of the American submarines Darter and Dace prepared for their journey back to Australia. Running low on provisions and exhausted from the constant vigilance their lengthy patrol demanded, the submariners counted hours until October 23rd, when they could finally set course for Australia. Fresh food, mail from home, and 2 blessed weeks of shore leave. Our thoughts were more on that island, on fresh food, mail from home, and the 2 weeks of shore leave than on the war, Lieutenant Commander R.C. Benitez of the Dace would later recall. Just 1 more day separated them from rest and relaxation rather than responsibility and combat. Commander David H.M.C. Clintock of Darter and Commander Bladen D. Claggett of Dace had already issued orders that would extract their boats from the war zone within hours. On October 22nd, following standard procedure, both submarines surfaced at dusk, and the calm seas mirrored the peaceful state of mind aboard the pair of vessels. Everything changed shortly after midnight on October 23rd, when Darter's lookouts spotted a group of ships steaming into the southern entrance of Palawan Passage, approximately 350 miles west of Leyte Gulf. MC Clintock ordered both boats to close on the targets, a maneuver that required them to race at top speed through an area ominously nicknamed the Dangerous Ground, a treacherous expanse of water studded with reefs, shoals, and rocks. If they hoped to reach an advantageous intercept position, however, the submarines had no choice but to risk these perilous waters. As MC Clintock and Claggett maneuvered closer to the enemy force, they noticed something astonishing. The enemy commander had posted no destroyers ahead of his formation to guard against frontal attack. Instead, he churned forward in 2 sections, each built around primary columns of heavy cruisers and battleships, with light cruisers and destroyers providing flank protection. While this formation shielded against submarine attacks from the sides, it left the Japanese commander catastrophically vulnerable to a torpedo assault from dead ahead. Even more remarkably, heavy and light cruisers rather than expendable destroyers led the columns. The light cruiser Noshiro stood at the head of one column, while the heavy cruisers Myoko and Atago led 2 adjoining columns. This formation practically invited an attack on Japan's more valuable cruisers instead of the more expendable destroyers. The sinking of Atago, which served as Kurita's flagship, would plunge the formation into chaos, leaving the Japanese without their commander at the crucial moment of contact. MC Clintock and Claggett also found it peculiar that a Japanese commander would deliberately steam through the narrow Palawan Passage when alternative routes existed. Kurita, however, had selected this path despite the threats of reefs and American submarines because it placed him beyond the search range of American planes operating from the Philippines. Additionally, this shorter route eliminated any need to refuel at sea, a time-consuming and vulnerable operation. The 2 submarine commanders reached their intercept positions shortly after 5 o'clock in the morning. The Japanese would first encounter Darter, positioned on the northwest sector of the enemy fleet. Claggett halted about 5 miles northeast of Darter, prepared to launch his torpedoes if the Japanese veered to starboard to evade MC Clintock's attack. MC Clintock fired the opening shots of what would become known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf at 5:32 in the morning, unleashing 6 torpedoes from his bow tubes at Kurita's flagship Atago from less than 1,000 yards. The moment the 6th torpedo cleared its tube, MC Clintock swung his stern tubes to bear and fired 4 more, this time aimed at the second ship in line, the heavy cruiser Takao. 5 violent eruptions quickly confirmed to MC Clintock that most of his initial salvo had found their mark. From his more distant position, Claggett watched the spectacle unfold through his periscope. As the torpedoes detonated, he shouted to those nearby, "It looks like the 4th of July out there. One is burning. The Japs are milling and firing all over the place. What a show!" What a show! MC Clintock's torpedoes reaped devastating dividends. Within 30 minutes, Kurita's flagship vanished beneath the waves, leaving a frustrated commander floating in the water. Takao sustained such catastrophic damage that she had to reverse course and limp back toward Brunei. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was mere moments old, and already Kurita had lost 2 heavy cruisers. Now it was Claggett's turn. With Kurita in the water, Rear Admiral Madame Ugaki assumed temporary command. He increased the formation's speed to rapidly outdistance his submerged adversary, but this maneuver only delivered him directly into Claggett's sights. 4 torpedoes streaked from Dace straight into the heavy cruiser Maya, which erupted in tremendous explosions before plunging beneath the surface. A waterlogged and exhausted Kurita was just being hauled aboard the destroyer Kishinami when he witnessed a series of flashes in the distance. He turned to watch the death throes of yet another of his vessels. The eruptions generated such thunderous noise that the Americans aboard Dace feared for their own survival. On our way down, a crackling noise that started very faintly but which rapidly reached staggering proportion soon enveloped us. Lieutenant Commander Benitez wrote, "It was akin to the noise made by cellophane when it is crumpled. Those of us experienced in submarine warfare knew that a ship was breaking up. But the noise was so close, so loud, so gruesome that we came to believe that it was not but the Dace that was doomed. Some crew members worried that their own boat was disintegrating, while others entertained the horrifying possibility that a ship destroyed by their torpedoes might plummet directly onto the submarine, crushing it or pinning it to the seafloor." The diving officer, his face etched with concern, said to Claggett, "We better get the hell out of here." As Dace sped away, the boat shuddered from Japanese depth charges. For several hours, the crew endured a series of attacks that rocked the submarine, shattered light bulbs, scattered the contents of lockers, and sent tools clattering to the floor. "The Japs were very mad and we were very scared," Benitez admitted, but the Japanese departed without landing a decisive blow. Later that day, after waiting a prudent interval, Claggett surfaced to find an empty sea. The Japanese had steamed beyond view, but the dangerous reefs and shoals remained. A few minutes into October 24th, Dace received an alarming message from Darter reporting that the boat had run aground on one of the numerous reefs. When Dace moved in for a closer look, Claggett could clearly see Darter's propellers jutting out of the water. He had no alternative but to evacuate Darter's crew aboard his own boat, then destroy the stranded submarine to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. Crewmen placed demolition charges aboard Darter, but all failed to detonate properly. Claggett then fired 4 torpedoes, but because Darter sat so high out of the water, each missile exploded harmlessly against the reef. Claggett now turned to his final option, using his deck gun to sink the submarine. He hesitated because this would require the full deck gun crew of 25 men to be exposed on deck. Should an enemy aircraft appear in daylight while they attempted to destroy Darter, it would force Claggett into an emergency dive, and some of those men might not reach the tower hatch in time. He knew he had to accept that risk. Dace's gun peppered Darter without inflicting significant damage. After demolition charges, 4 torpedoes, and sustained gunfire had all failed to sink Darter, some crew members joked that perhaps they would be safer aboard the beached boat. Their laughter died quickly when Claggett's worst fear materialized. A Japanese plane veered toward them in an obvious bombing run around 6 o'clock in the morning. The 25 crewmen scrambled for the 25-inch tower hatch in a frantic rush as Claggett prepared his boat for an emergency dive. Some men slid down the hatch, others tumbled headfirst, and still others were shoved down by anxious mates behind them. But miraculously, all entered the boat safely before the waters engulfed her. Claggett remained near Darter until nightfall, when he maneuvered closer to make another attempt at sinking the boat. As he prepared to launch additional torpedoes, the ping of underwater echo ranging indicated the presence of another submarine. Since no other American boats operated in these waters, Claggett decided to abandon Darter and extract both crews from harm's way. He set a course for Australia and departed the Palawan Passage. The action in Palawan Passage delivered the United States a victory in the opening phase of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. At the cost of 1 abandoned submarine, Darter, American forces sank 2 cruisers, damaged another, and eliminated 2 destroyers that were detached to escort the crippled Takao back to Brunei. Before the Japanese commander had engaged enemy surface forces, he watched his flotilla reduced by 5 ships. More critically, his presence in Palawan Passage had been reported to American naval commanders, which meant an air attack loomed, followed by a probable confrontation with an American Navy arrayed to halt his advance. This realization would test any commander's mettle. But Kurita had just emerged from the harrowing ordeal of abandoning his sinking flagship and leaping into the sea to preserve his life, magnifying the psychological impact. If disaster could strike so swiftly in his journey to the Philippines, what awaited him as he drew nearer to the enemy? To compound matters, his dunking in Palawan Passage aggravated a physical ailment caused by dengue fever. When the Japanese cleared Palawan Passage late on October 23 and entered the Sibuyan Sea, Kurita transferred his command from the diminutive Kishinami to the super battleship Yamato. While he still controlled a formidable force, including 5 battleships and 9 cruisers, the submarine attacks had rattled him. Admiral Ugaki wrote of October 23, "A bad day is a bad day to the end. Worse days lay ahead." Steaming in the waters off the eastern Philippine coast with his mighty force of aircraft carriers, Admiral Halsey eagerly anticipated action with the Japanese fleet. Known throughout the United States for his aggressive temperament and bitter denunciations of the enemy, Halsey had missed participating in the war's major carrier battles to date. The Battle of the Coral Sea unfolded while Halsey ferried into position the bombers led by General Jimmy Doolittle for his legendary 1942 Tokyo raid. A severe skin rash confined him to a Hawaiian hospital while his subordinate, Raymond Spruance, led American forces to victory in the pivotal Battle of Midway. 2 years later, Admiral Spruance again commanded the American fleet during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Irritated by these absences, Halsey intended to compensate by engaging the Japanese in the next surface action. He knew the enemy fleet would almost certainly sortie in response to General Douglas MacArthur's assault on the Philippines, so he prowled the Philippine Sea, searching for enemy carriers he felt certain would appear. One possible route for the Japanese was to sortie from the Singapore area and approach the Philippines from the west. Since he positioned his carriers on the land's eastern side, Halsey contemplated moving west through the narrow waters of San Bernardino Strait to be positioned to engage the enemy should they actually materialize. Halsey's superior, Admiral Chester Nimitz, quickly quashed this notion. He reminded Halsey that his primary responsibility was covering the invasion forces in Leyte Gulf, not pursuing enemy carriers. Nimitz admonished Halsey not to steam through the strait unless he received explicit orders to do so. With that plan negated, Halsey began rotating his exhausted task groups, which had been at sea for 10 months, to Ulithi for rest and replenishment. On October 22nd, he ordered Task Group 38.1 under Vice Admiral John S.M.C. Kane off station toward Ulithi and instructed Rear Admiral Ralph E. Davison to commence preparations for removing Task Group 38.4 from the line the following day. Everything changed in the early pre-dawn minutes of October 23rd, when Halsey received the intelligence forwarded by Darter reporting that many ships, including 3 probable BBS, had been sighted. Halsey immediately canceled Davison's departure and ordered his 3 task groups to refuel and move closer to the Philippine coast to reduce flight time westward to the Sibuyan Sea. Halsey's carrier forces steamed into position during the night of October 23rd. Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman's Task Group 38.3 took station off the Polillo Islands east of Luzon. To the southeast, 140 miles distant, Rear Admiral Gerald F. Bogan guided Task Group 38.2, which included Admiral Halsey off San Bernardino Strait, while Davison occupied the southernmost position off Leyte Gulf, 120 miles southeast of Bogan. All 3 prepared to launch search planes at daylight. To ensure detection of the enemy, Halsey ordered an exhaustive examination of the western approaches to the Philippines. He assigned to each carrier group a search arc extending 300 miles, with teams consisting of 1 Curtiss Helldiver bomber and 2 Hellcat fighters tasked with covering each 10-degree segment of the arc. As backup, Halsey also stationed additional fighters at 100-mile intervals to relay messages from the search planes to the carriers. Aboard his flagship, the carrier Essex, Admiral Sherman worried that this excessive deployment of fighters might compromise his ability to defend himself. But he proceeded with the orders without voicing his objections. All search planes lifted off at daybreak. At 8:20 in the morning, one of Bogan's pilots reported 5 battleships 9 cruisers and 13 destroyers south of Mindoro Island, steaming into the Sibuyan Sea. 7 minutes later, Halsey ordered his 3 groups to move closer together, and at 8:37 he issued the command, strike. Repeat, strike. Good luck. Admiral Sherman had just turned his carriers into the wind to launch his strike when radar operators detected 3 incoming enemy formations of 50 to 60 aircraft each from the west and southwest. His fear about lacking sufficient fighter strength now materialized. He could either follow Halsey's orders and launch an airstrike, or postpone the strike so his fighters could protect the ships. But he could not do both. He had little choice but to cancel the offensive strike so his fighters could intercept the approaching enemy. What he had detected were Japanese land-based aircraft from Luzon, the same aircraft Kurita had expected would provide his air support. They had instead been deployed against American ships, as Japanese commanders believed the vessels would present a more opportune target for their inexperienced aviators. In addition to these 3 air groups, a 4th group of 76 aircraft also approached from the Japanese carrier force steaming down from the north. Sherman hastily postponed the airstrike against Kurita until his fighters could repel the more immediate threat posed by the Japanese aerial assault. He launched every available fighter, far too few in his estimation, then turned his ships into one of the nearby rain squalls for cover, like soldiers going into their foxholes. Throughout the day, we played hide and seek in these squalls. Lieutenant Carl Brown was flying combat air patrol over the carrier Princeton when the Japanese struck. Although outnumbered, he and his fellow pilots immediately plunged into the fray. We estimated that there were 65 fighters and 15 bombers in the attack, Brown later recalled. Ordinarily, we would not have tackled 80 planes with 8 Hellcats, but it was get them before they reached our ships. It had been drilled into us from the time we were in pre-flight school that the primary task of a Navy fighter pilot is to protect his ship. Brown and the other aviators exceeded all expectations in protecting the carriers. Despite their inferior numbers, American fighter pilots shredded the Japanese formations as if they had been stationary targets. The engagement resembled the Marianas Turkey Shoot, in which American flyers had achieved such spectacular tallies earlier in the year. Commander David M.C. Campbell was one of the aviators fortunate enough to have participated in the Marianas slaughter. In one frantic day, he had splashed 7 enemy aircraft to become an instant ace. He could never have imagined that he would surpass that incredible performance this October 24th. When he received the order to intercept the enemy planes, M.C. Campbell, accompanied by his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, wondered how to proceed. The pair of flyers faced an oncoming enemy force of more than 40 aircraft, so he radioed back to Essex's Combat Information Center. "My wingman and I are up here alone with about 40 fighters. What do you suggest that we do, attack them or not?" The fighter director officer, John Connolly, later to become governor of Texas, was uncertain about the proper course of action, so he replied, "Well, use your best judgment." M.C. Campbell chose the offensive. He and Rushing waited approximately 2,000 feet above the Japanese, who had formed into a tight circular formation called the Loughborough, seeking the altitude advantage when the enemy left the formation to attack. When they observed the enemy breaking out of the Loughborough, M.C. Campbell and Rushing executed repeated runs on the less experienced pilots. "I would pick out my plane. Then he'd pick out his." M.C. Campbell wrote after the war. "We'd make an attack, pull up, keep our altitude advantage and speed, and go down again. We repeated this over and over. We made about 20 coordinated attacks. As the pair downed enemy planes, M.C. Campbell marked the tally in pencil on his dashboard. At the conclusion of the encounter, M.C. Campbell had shot down 9 enemy aircraft, while Rushing added another 6. In the ready room after the melee, another aviator boasted that he had registered 5 kills that morning and asked how many M.C. Campbell had notched. The pilot lapsed into silence when he learned his comrade had shot down nearly twice that number. For his aerial feats, M.C. Campbell received the Medal of Honor. His citation read, in part, "During a major fleet engagement with the enemy on October 24th, Commander M.C. Campbell, assisted by but 1 plane, intercepted and daringly attacked a formation of 60 hostile land-based craft approaching our forces, shot down 9 Japanese planes and, completely disorganizing the enemy group, forced the remainder to abandon the attack before a single aircraft could reach the fleet. The group that faced M.C. Campbell failed to break through to the carriers, But at 9:39 in the morning, a solitary bomber from a different group exploited a moment when Princeton was recovering aircraft to slip in and drop a 550-pound bomb that plunged through the middle of the flight deck forward of the elevator. Since the bomb left only a small hole as it continued deeper inside the carrier, Captain William H. Buerker, Princeton's commanding officer, believed the damage could be swiftly repaired. Aboard Essex, Admiral Sherman also dismissed the bomb hit, as I felt the Princeton was much too tough a ship for one hit by a 500-pound bomb to cause any very serious damage. Both officers underestimated the severity. The bomb penetrated through both the flight deck and the hangar deck before detonating in the ship's bakery, where it killed everyone stationed there. The explosion tore open the hangar deck, where aircraft loaded with ammunition and fuel erupted in flames. Buerker initiated salvage control phase I at 10:10 in the morning, which evacuated 1,100 men from the stricken ship. Only firefighters to battle the inferno and gunners to defend the ship from subsequent air attacks remained on the burning vessel. When ammunition stored in lockers began exploding, Buerker ordered the gunners to abandon ship as well. By early afternoon, firefighters appeared to have gained control of the situation. The light cruiser Birmingham pulled alongside at 1:30 in the afternoon to take the carrier under tow. Crew members assembled in repair parties, brought out lines, manned guns, and commenced the intricate process of bringing the larger vessel under tow when, around 3:30 in the afternoon, a massive explosion tore open large portions of Princeton and showered Birmingham with lethal metallic fragments. The explosion was as surprising as it was terrifying, a survivor later said. I think it can well be compared to a small volcano. A considerable portion of the after part of the Princeton was blown into the air and fell in the water astern. Flying fragments, some huge, some small, burst outwards and upwards, showering the deck of Birmingham from stem to stern. The men on Birmingham's deck were caught in the open, their fates sealed by where they stood and which path the metallic missiles took. Men dropped as if cut by massive scythes, and blood washed freely across the deck. Despite the horror, men shook off their stupor and began helping the wounded. Their valor was matched by the composure exhibited by those felled by the blast. I really have no words at my command that can adequately describe the veritable splendor of the conduct of all hands, wounded and unwounded, explained Birmingham's executive officer. Men with legs off, arms off, with gaping wounds in their sides, with the tops of their heads furrowed by fragments, would insist, I'm all right. Take care of Joe over there. Or, don't waste morphine on me, Commander. Just hit me over the head. Terrible as the destruction was, it is a source of supreme gratification to know the heights of courage and forgetfulness of self to which one's shipmates can rise. Captain Buerker had no choice but to order the remaining crew members off Princeton. At 4:38 in the afternoon, after ensuring that no one alive remained aboard, Buerker stepped off the carrier. The cruiser Reno fired 2 torpedoes into Princeton that sent her to the bottom. In all, more than 100 men from Princeton and 220 from Birmingham perished, while another 430 suffered wounds. Although Birmingham's starboard side resembled Swiss cheese more than a ship's hull, she retained enough power and stability to slowly head back to port for repairs. While Admiral Sherman repelled the Japanese air attack, Bogan and Davison launched their strikes against Kurita, now commanding from the super battleship Yamato. For 4 hours, from mid-morning until early afternoon, American carrier planes struck Kurita's forces steaming across the Sibuyan Sea on the Philippines' western side 5 separate times. The initial raid consisted of 45 fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes from the carriers Intrepid and Cabot. Fair weather greeted the aviators, as fluffy clouds lightly sprinkled a clear blue sky buffeted with easterly winds. Below, verdant tropical isles with soaring mountain peaks breaking through green foliage dotted the turquoise waters. The scene hardly suggested the bitter battle about to be fought in its environs, Admiral Sherman later wrote. The first aircraft commenced their runs at 10:26 in the morning. The intensity of the Japanese anti-aircraft barrage stunned American pilots, who did not know that the enemy had purposely strengthened each ship's defenses to compensate for the lack of air cover. More than 100 guns boomed from Kurita's battleships, including his heaviest batteries, while cruisers added another 90 guns per ship and destroyers nearly 40. Anti-aircraft guns shredded the peaceful skies with varied colors of shell bursts, casting lethal shrapnel toward the oncoming American planes. The cumulative effect was terrific, wrote one aviator of the pink, purple, and white-hued eruptions that surrounded his aircraft in the way down. The pilots, pleasantly surprised by the absence of enemy fighters, droned toward their targets. The fighters descended first to send the Japanese scrambling for cover. Then the torpedo planes and dive bombers attacked against what they hoped would be a disorganized defense. Most aircraft focused on the giant battleship Musashi, whose reinforced steel plates absorbed most of the damage in this attack. The cruiser Myoko, however, had to turn back toward Brunei due to damage sustained. After a second strike inflicted further damage to Musashi and other ships, Kurita sent off an urgent message to Admiral Ozawa inquiring whether he had succeeded in luring Halsey away from San Bernardino Strait. "We are being subjected to repeated enemy carrier-based air attacks," Kurita informed Ozawa. "Advise immediately of contacts and attacks made by you on the enemy." Kurita also requested fighter assistance from Manila, but those aircraft were then engaged in attacking Sherman. The best he could hope for now was that Ozawa had removed from the scene some of the enemy forces arrayed against him. Pilots in Halsey's third air attack, which arrived over Kurita in the early afternoon, noticed the now vulnerable Musashi struggling to maintain headway and concentrated their efforts against her. A string of bombs and torpedoes cracked the battleship's sturdy hull, releasing a torrent of ocean water into No. 4 engine room. The subsequent loss of power caused Musashi to list dangerously. Commander Dan Smith, the commanding officer of an air group from the carrier Enterprise, participated in this third attack. "When we winged over for our dive, we entered a cloud bank and the guns went silent because they couldn't see us. When we emerged from the clouds, they opened up again like the hammers of hell. I personally saw all 8 of our torpedo planes score direct hits on the bow of Musashi, and saw 5 direct hits and 3 near misses from our bombers. The last time I saw Musashi, she was stopped dead in the water, and her entire forecastle was awash." The final 2 attacks concentrated on sinking Musashi and blasting Kurita's other major combatants. Aircraft from Admiral Sherman's task group joined in now that the Japanese air threat had been eliminated by M.C. Campbell and the other brave aviators. 1 bomb struck Musashi's tower housing the command bridges, and 10 torpedoes slammed against her hull, while other aircraft executed a relentless attack on Kurita's cruisers and destroyers. The hapless Japanese commander, steaming without air cover to shield him, could do little but hope his anti-aircraft guns could repel the opposition before it inflicted catastrophic damage. Later that day, after being pounded by 17 bomb and 19 torpedo hits, Musashi sank, taking with her 1,100 men. With the 5th and final air attack concluded, Halsey's carrier aircraft had flown 259 sorties against Kurita. Japanese guns splashed only 18 American planes, such an insignificant number that Admiral Ugaki wrote in his diary. "The small number of enemy planes shot down is regrettable." Against this meager loss, American pilots inflicted heavy punishment. The battleships Yamato, Haruna, and Nagato sustained damage. The cruiser Myoko was forced back to Brunei for repairs, and Musashi had been lost. As was often true in warfare, Halsey's aviators reported more damage than was actually inflicted. Exaggerated claims led the admiral to believe that Kurita was a beaten man commanding a shattered force, someone who now could be discounted in favor of searching for a larger prize, enemy carriers. Halsey had missed several such opportunities earlier in the war, and he was not about to let Providence steal another chance from him. Consequently, he too quickly dismissed the importance of Kurita so he could embark on a search for enemy carriers. This would lead to near catastrophe. Despite his casualties, Kurita retained an armada of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that could, if fortune veered in his favor, badly sting the Americans. While Halsey turned his attention away from the Sibuyan Sea, Kurita pondered a critical decision. His staff, fearing that additional American air attacks would gradually annihilate the force, urged him to reverse course and regroup. Kurita also understood that if he continued toward the Philippines at his current speed, he would enter the narrow San Bernardino Strait before darkness could provide some protection. The last thing he wanted was to face an air attack while steaming in narrow waters that prevented proper maneuvering. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Kurita thus ordered his ships to reverse course and head west to move beyond bombing range. 30 minutes later, he informed Admiral Toyota, "Were we to force our way through the strait, We would merely make ourselves meat for the enemy, with very little chance of success. It was therefore concluded that the best course open to us was temporarily to retire beyond the reach of enemy planes. This prudent measure by Kurita, however sound for the safety of his men and ships, disrupted the entire timetable of the complex Japanese operation by 7 hours, the time lost while Kurita retired. On the other side, Halsey drew a false conclusion when American search planes spotted Kurita's force reversing course. He assumed that Kurita was retreating in defeat, when in fact he was merely regrouping and waiting for a better opportunity to approach. When Kurita had steamed westward for several hours without suffering any subsequent air attacks, he again contemplated rushing through San Bernardino Strait. Perhaps the enemy had pulled back, which would allow Kurita to steam across the Sibuyan Sea and risk a night passage through San Bernardino. A message from Toyota strengthened his resolve. With confidence in heavenly guidance, all forces will attack, ordered the admiral. Toyota's chief of staff prodded Kurita even more forcefully when he stated that the change in schedule could mean failure for the whole operation. It is ardently desired that this force continue its action as prearranged. Kurita threw caution to the wind. At 5:14 in the afternoon, he turned back toward the Philippines and dispatched a message to Toyota stating, "Braving any loss and damage we may suffer, the first striking force will break into Leyte Gulf and fight to the last manual." With the dual moves of Kurita again heading toward San Bernardino Strait and Halsey turning his attention away from the strait toward the location of Japanese carriers, the first phase of the Battle of Leyte Gulf concluded. American aircraft had inflicted punishing blows to Kurita, but they had been by no means fatal. Kurita retained sufficient power to seriously impede American operations in Leyte Gulf, should he succeed in fighting his way through. Halsey acknowledged as much when he wrote afterward, "The most conspicuous lesson learned from this action is the practical difficulty of crippling by airstrikes alone, a task force of heavy ships at sea and free to maneuver." Kurita's chief of staff, Tomiji Koyanagi, expressed similar sentiments. He acknowledged that Kurita had suffered heavy losses, but only grudgingly. "We had expected air attacks, but this days were almost enough to discourage us." Had Halsey's raids been more severe, Koyanagi would never have used the word almost. Koyanagi blamed Halsey for allowing Kurita to later slip through San Bernardino Strait. Had Halsey ordered more air attacks than the 5 that occurred, he would have known that Kurita had not reversed for good, and that he once more steamed toward the Philippines. Halsey could have then bided his time until Kurita steamed into his clutches. If he had done so, a night engagement against our exhausted force would undoubtedly have been disastrous for us, Koyanagi wrote. He added, "Thus the enemy missed an opportunity to annihilate the Japanese fleet through his failure to maintain contact in the evening of October 24th. Halsey should have been guarding the eastern exit of the strait, but when Kurita barreled through, much to his astonishment, he found nothing but open water and a free path to Leyte Gulf. Only the gallant stand of Taffy 3, a group of 13 tiny escort carriers, and their smaller escorts, later prevented Kurita from steaming into Leyte Gulf and wreaking havoc on the invasion forces. On the other hand, Halsey's pummeling of Kurita and other events transformed the Japanese commander into a timid leader. Within a 24-hour period, Kurita lost 5 ships to American submarines, had his flagship sunk beneath him, endured the humiliation of being plucked from the sea, watched as a series of American air attacks reduced his forces, and left him no respite to let down his guard, fretted that he could do little to fight back except employ his ship's guns, and witnessed enemy aircraft sink Musashi, one of the mightiest battleships afloat. The cumulative effect of these actions made the weary Kurita more hesitant, less aggressive, and more amenable to terminating his mission. The next day, when he encountered Taffy 3, these factors played a crucial part in the outcome. At the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito greeted the news with grimness. The course of events in the Philippines was not what he had hoped, and he feared that the path led only to the enemy dislodging his military from that crucial land. With resignation in his voice, Hirohito turned to an aide and muttered, "Aso deska," which meant, "It is so." The Battle of the Sibuyan Sea thus ended not with a decisive victory for either side, but with both fleets bloodied and their commanders making fateful decisions that would shape the remainder of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese had demonstrated remarkable courage in pressing forward despite overwhelming odds. while the Americans had shown the devastating power of naval aviation. Yet the coming days would prove that this was merely the opening act of a much larger drama, one that would ultimately seal the fate of Japan's remaining naval power and bring the Americans one step closer to the home islands themselves.